morning, everyone. This is a first series of a English dialogue that Gang Li Tai is going to put out to everyone. Now, because I think why are we going to issue a series of English dialogue? I think because, as you are all aware, there's a lot of fake news and all this very different sort of rumors going through. And now it's not only just in Hong Kong, but it's spreading internationally. And in order to sustain our national security and also to spread and also to get the right message through, hence the Citizens Alliance of Hong Kong, the YouTube channel Gang Li Tai is going to have a dialogue to share with everyone, and hopefully also with our audiences in the international arena, including Chinese and also the locals, and hopefully we'll get more aware of what's going on in Hong Kong and also in the rest of the world. Hence, very pleased that today we also very honored to, are grateful to China Resource Capital for sponsoring us this wonderful venue in Wan Chai, the renovation, which is a fantastic venue for people to gather, share their common goals, and also get together and get to a better world. So China Citizens of Hong Kong is going to issue a number of series in this particular venue. And of course, for the COVID, when it's getting better, we actually would like to welcome everyone to come physically, to come to this venue, because apart from interacting online, we would very much like to see you offline as well. Physically interaction is a very important part of communication. So we hope to see you again in the next series, because we're going to have series different languages in Cantonese, in Mandarin, and also in English. So watch out for our YouTube channel and also for our messages, WeChat messages and Facebook. And we will really welcome every one of you to come and share your ideas and inspiration with us. So without further ado, today we have our very esteemed speaker, Dr. Beattie from Chinese University of Hong Kong. He's an associate professor and he's specializing in political psychology. And he's now teaching a master course in global political economy. And I think it's a very important part that we would like to listen to the experts, and also from their own experience in their country, of how they see particular the political circumstances in Hong Kong and the rest of the world, and how U.S. influence of these different communications. And I think this is an important part for us to see how our strategy and how are we going to take charge of our own destiny. And in order to understand how the other country are playing the cards, and I think we are going to be in a much better position to see how we're going to manage our own country better. So, and also we are very honored to have our council member of Citizen Alliance of Hong Kong, Brian Lam, to facilitate this session. So I'm sure that you'll enjoy it, and hopefully you will stay with us and also watch out for our future series. Thank you. So the stage over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for coming to our session. Our topic today is how media affects public's opinion and how to affect their votes. It's a very interesting topic because as we see that we always say that we have free press and free media, but it seems like even if we have free press, free media, free speech, it seems like someone with some invisible hand is affecting how we think and how we vote. But this is very important to understand democracy and to understand election. And so I'll give the time to Peter Beattie to let him to introduce the situation in U.S. first, and then we are going to have a Q&A section.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, so I started off with this painting here. It's one of my favorite paintings. It's by Carlos Enriquez called Campesinos Felices, or Happy Peasants. And as you can see, the purpose of this painting is pretty clear. in the background you'll see a poster with a pig in a top hat, and it just says, vote. And it's pretty clear from the poverty of the people in the foreground that this is a pretty meaningless kind of vote when you're starving. How are you supposed to be participating in democracy? So that was Enriquez's point, but I think it is a broader point too, because it's not just that you need a certain degree of material sustenance. You also need information. You also need the leisure time to learn about politics, to learn about the election, to learn about the issues involved. And so I think this painting makes my point perfectly, because this talk is based on my book. I basically spent most of my life researching this because this topic is very interesting to me for my whole life. I started off very much on the far right in the U.S. Political context. And then I came to find that I couldn't defend some of the beliefs I had against criticisms that I encountered. And then I became fascinated by why do people believe what they believe about politics. So this is basically the result of all of my investigations over the years. So again, why do we believe what we believe about politics? So I start off with a focus on information. What is information? And the key takeaway is that I think normally when we think about information, we think of it as something ethereal, in the air. It's not really physical. It doesn't have a physical substance, but that's completely wrong. Information is always physical. So whether it's information in the sound waves that I'm producing right now, information in your neuronal connections in your brain, information in the magnetic pulses in our cell phones and computers, information is always encoded in some kind of physical substrate. So when we start to think about information in that way, we have to then start thinking about the logistical system for information. How is information transported from one place into hundreds of thousands, millions of households, into tens of millions of people's brains? The information that's relevant to politics is produced in many, many places, oftentimes capital cities, and we have to get that information and transport it all over the country, all over the world. So first, I try to focus people's attention on the physical nature of information and get people to think of it as something real and concrete. So that makes us think of the kind of information realm as an ecology, as an environment, just like you see in the biological world. You've got many different factors influencing how information spreads, what information spreads, what information does not spread. So I find the metaphor of an ecology very helpful. And then I kind of separate things into supply and demand side biases. So supply side biases are everything that affects what information is disseminated by the means of communication, which is another way of saying the media. So what influences what information is spread by the media. And then demand side biases are our psychological biases. What information are we more likely to accept as true? And what messages are we more likely to reject as false, and why? So on the demand side, you basically have a lot of effects of our long evolutionary history, why we have the brains we have, why we have the evolved psychology we have. And then, of course, we have a lot of cultural influences, which vary culture by culture. And then, of course, for the supply side, we're looking primarily at the news media, but also the educational system, all sorts of civic organizations, from churches to pressure groups, etc. So then I look at our evolutionary history. I'm not going to talk that much about that here because we have limited time. A little more about our social psychological biases, that is what I call the demand side biases. And then there's a lot of research on how the media affects what people believe directly. So this is kind of the intersection between supply side and demand side. And then there's a lot of work on the political economy of media. This is looking at supply side biases. What is influencing the topics that media outlets choose to cover, how they cover them, who they talk to, who they don't talk to, etc. And then lastly, there's research on comparative media studies, looking at different media systems around the world and tracing the different effects that different kinds of media systems have on society. So this is a quote from an old paper by a pretty mainstream political scientist, Robert Dahl. And this is not what he actually believes, but I think this quote points out something really important. He says, if political preferences are simply plugged into the system by leaders, whether they're business leaders or political leaders, in order to extract what they want from the system, then the model of plebiscitary democracy is substantially equivalent to the model of totalitarian rule. It's just totalitarian rule with one extra step. The extra step is you have to plug in the beliefs and the preferences into the system. Right, exactly. Without that, yeah, exactly. So I find that's a very interesting insight there, and I think that's largely how the US media system operates, unfortunately, although there are some signs of change. So not the Pope, Stalin was reported to have said, when asked, what does the Pope think, or what does the Catholic Church think? He says, well, how many divisions does the Pope have? He doesn't have any army. Who cares about the Pope? But the point there is soft power is real. I don't know how to say his name properly, but in English we call him Sun Tzu, the guy who wrote the Art of Sun Tzu. So he wrote The Art of War, and one of the things in The Art of War that sticks in my mind is the acme of skill, the height of skill, is to win a war without fighting a single battle. Yeah. Well, that's what soft power can do. If you can convince people to do what you want them to do, or believe what you want them to believe, you don't need to fight any battles. You've won the war. So that's the kind of power I think the media has. And then people will say, well, the US media system is a free press. There's no government control. So how can the US media system comprise a propaganda system? So they'll say, there's no conspiracy behind the media, giving orders, telling newspaper writers, you better write this way or you're going to be thrown in jail or you're going to lose your job. Journalists are basically free to say whatever they like to say. Journalists are often adversarial towards the government. We saw that a lot during the Trump era. We're seeing that again during the Biden presidency. The U.S. is an open society. There isn't any overt, official system of censorship. And then they'll say, well, if you notice, all of these people who criticize the media, they tend to be outside of the ideological mainstream. So it's probably that they're just frustrated by the fact that other people don't believe what they believe, and so that's why they're criticizing the media. And what I do in the book is say, yeah, all of these are true, but they don't comprise a rejoinder, a counter-argument to the argument that the US media system actually acts like a propaganda system. And so I'll try to explain why. So on information, there's three areas in social science research that I think are relevant to help us understand information and its role in politics. So one, you have social evolution theory. All of you are probably familiar with the word meme. When you think of meme, you think of a photo like this on the internet, right? Yeah. So the original word meme came from a book by Richard Dawkins. And it was in one of the final chapters where he basically makes an analogy between the way that biological evolution operates and the way that cultural evolution operates. And so just like the gene is the fundamental unit of biological evolution, he proposed the meme as the fundamental unit of intellectual evolution, cultural evolution, social evolution. And so that's where the meme word originally came from. And since then, it's evolved into a different meaning, that it's one of these pictures that, people change the words and they make new jokes, etc. But basically, this is the only explanation for the richness and diversity of our cultural world, of our intellectual world, that exists, other than a kind of spiritual or religious explanation that we have a soul, and this spiritual soul can basically do all of these magical things, like create new ideas and new theories and ideologies, etc. But social evolution theory explains all of that through the same way that the diversity of the biological world is explained. It's the same evolutionary process. You have variation, selection, and retention. And through this simple kind of algorithmic process, you can produce massive amounts of complexity. Then there's schema research. It's not really schema theory because there isn't much theory behind it, but it's psychologists looking at how the brain stores and processes information. And just to simplify it in a very, very short period of time, basically you can think of it like a network diagram. So you have one concept like democracy, and that's stored in a neural network in our brains, and that's connected to a bunch of other things. For a lot of people, democracy is connected to positive affect, that is good feeling. We feel good about it, we feel like it's a good thing. Democracy might be connected to the US, it might be connected to the EU. It might be connected with ideas of freedom, it might be connected with ideas of escaping oppression. You know, but just imagine this kind of network diagram where a central concept is connected to a bunch of other concepts, and it's also connected to our emotions. Another thing it's connected to is memories. So for instance, if you have a schema, this concept for something like poverty. Everyone has a schema for poverty. They all understand what poverty is in the abstract. But if you're someone who has actually experienced poverty, your schema in your brain for poverty is also going to be connected to memories and feelings of what it felt like to, you know, struggle, what it felt like to see other people who were not poor, who were wealthy, enjoying life more than you and not having to worry about, you know, your mother in the hospital and whether you could take care of her, etc. So even though we might have the same schema, it's fundamentally different because we all have different experiences. And then lastly, there's this field in psychology called social representations. And that's really interesting because that field, from the very beginning, the first instance of it was looking at psychoanalysis, the Freudian theory of psychology, and looking at how it spread in French society primarily through the media. So they looked at different kinds of media. You had the Catholic media, you had the socialist media, you had the kind of mainstream capitalist media, and they looked at how these different kinds of media outlets presented psychoanalysis in fundamentally different ways, so that people who were reading the Catholic media understood it in a very different way from people who were reading the socialist media. So in the socialist media, they said this is a quack theory. It's attempting to provide support for the system by saying, if you are maladjusted to the system, that is your problem. It couldn't possibly be that the system is the problem. Whereas people in the learning about psychoanalysis from the Catholic media would understand it in a way that meshed with their Catholic ideas. Like, oh, psychoanalysis is kind of like confession. Instead of going to a priest and confessing, you go to a psychoanalyst, and he or she helps you, get through your problems. So these are basically the ways that social scientists have tried to understand information and how it operates in society. The way I like to think of it is as when you combine all of these, it's kind of like the ideas in our heads, the information in our heads, our schemas. It's kind of like looking at a night sky, and all of the stars represent a bit of information. So here, imagine that all of these stars are bits of information relevant to the Iraq War. Let's say we're in 2003, early 2003, and you're in the US and you've learned bits of information that are relevant to this push for war that the Bush administration is trying to orchestrate. So maybe like one of these stars is...
laundry powder.
Oh, right, anthrax, yeah. So maybe one of these stars is, you've heard Colin Powell at the UN say that Saddam Hussein has, laundry powder, but it's actually anthrax or what have you. One of these stars is reports that the Niger uranium reports. Yeah. But, in my understanding at the time, I had heard from friends from other countries, their media systems had different information. So I learned a bit about how Saddam Hussein was always very much opposed to Islamic fundamentalism. So that was another star in my mind. I could see that in the night sky. I also had learned that US foreign policy has largely been about maximizing power, not about human rights or caring for spreading democracy. It's been about maximizing power and controlling resources. So that was another star in my night sky. So I could kind of piece them together into a constellation, and I could see this constellation. Oh, okay, well, look, there's a guy with a bow. This looks very clear. It's a guy pulling back a bow about to fire an arrow. And that's kind of like how the bits of information we have, we organize into a narrative or an ideology, our worldview. So I had all of this information, and I thought, okay, this war is unjustifiable. The reasons for it are insufficient. It seems rather that the Bush administration is trying to create a story to scare people, to get them to support the war. But the story is unbelievable because of the history of U.S. foreign policy, the fact that weapons inspectors from the UN were saying that there are no WMD. However, for most of the people in the U.S., it was kind of like looking at the same sky, but there was a cloud. So when you're looking at the night sky and there's a cloud, you can't see some of the stars. So you can't see that picture of the guy with the bow and arrow. It doesn't make any sense because there's this cloud in the way. So that's kind of how I look at a media system that does not provide people with a full, sort of the full picture, with a true variety of ideological perspectives and the information that make them up. So this is kind of the night sky that most people in the US were looking at. They had the bits of information from the Bush administration saying, oh, you know, Saddam Hussein might have been in bed with Al-Qaeda. Saddam Hussein might have been trying to buy uranium from Niger, etc. So they had all of that, but they didn't have the information that I had been exposed to. The history of US foreign policy, the UN weapons inspectors saying it's highly unlikely that there were any weapons of mass destruction. They didn't have the information about Saddam Hussein always being strongly opposed to Islamic fundamentalism. So this is kind of what you get when you have a media system that doesn't provide a full range of ideological perspectives. You can't really, I could try to tell people, hey, you know what I'm seeing is a guy with a bow and arrow. But everyone else is saying, what are you talking about? That makes no sense. I don't see any bow and arrow here. So it's kind of like looking at the night sky when a cloud is occluding some of the stars. So for most people in the US, like, they wouldn't get this joke. This is a cartoon, and you've got surgeons operating on someone, and they're about to blow up a bomb, put a bomb in the middle of the person, and they say, all right, now to get rid of that pesky cancer that's rumored to be in there. And the headline here is, this is US foreign policy. Most people wouldn't get that because they don't have the information required to make that funny. Likewise, this cartoon, we must always be ready to kill anyone who doesn't love peace as much as we do. Most people in the US would not get that because they don't know anything about the Obama administration's foreign policy, supporting the war in Yemen, arming jihadi groups in Syria, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like a night sky where there's a cloud, you don't see some of the stars, so how can you understand, how can you see that constellation? Or in our terms, how can you understand the perspective that I had during the Iraq War of being opposed to the war for the reasons why I was opposed to it? You don't have that information. You were never provided it. You can't see those stars. It makes no sense. So that's the fundamental problem. And I think this view is hard for a lot of people to see because I think, this is my assumption here, I think most of our implicit belief is that we all kind of occupy an intellectual Mount Olympus. And we can look down on all ideas and ideologies and perspectives in the world, and we can judge them and say, oh no, that one's not good, that one makes a lot of sense. I see everything, I understand everything, and I've just selected the true beliefs. But that's highly unlikely to be the case because we really don't know all of the information in the various belief systems out there. This is just an illusion. Really what we're all seeing is the same night sky, but certain stars are occluded. We actually don't have that information in our brains to the same extent as the ideologue has. So if I'm a libertarian, I might think, oh, I know socialism very well and I reject it because it's a terrible ideology. But you don't actually have the information in your brain to the same extent as a socialist does, because they've read a lot more. They have a much more dense schematic network stored in their brain than the libertarian does. But the libertarian thinks that he's on Mount Olympus, looking down on all the world of ideas and just rejecting socialism because it's a terrible ideology. And that goes for the socialists looking at the libertarians' idea as well. Okay, so I'm going to skip past a lot of this evolution stuff, but a lot of people still have this idea that our human prehistory was this kind of brutal, caveman, like the caveman dragging the woman by the hair or something. And this is actually from a club in Mexico. But it kind of sums up a lot of people's ideas about what human prehistory was like. But it really is not that way. And there's a lot of evidence as to why this would be the case. But one of the pieces of evidence is sexual dimorphism. That is the difference in size between males and females of a species. So you see, for chimpanzees, there's a greater degree of sexual dimorphism. The males are significantly bigger than the females. Then in our closest animal relatives, the bonobos, there's a smaller degree of sexual dimorphism. And in humans, you also have a similarly small degree of sexual dimorphism. That in itself indicates a less competitive history of our species. In a highly competitive species like the chimpanzees, there's a greater degree because males need to beat each other up and fight more. Another indication of our species' greater degree of cooperation during our history is this. Of all the 200 plus primate species, we're the only ones that have white sclera, I don't know how to pronounce that word. We have whites of our eyes. Why is that relevant? Because we're always communicating the direction of our gaze. That's not good if we're primarily competitive, because if I see a juicy, fruit tree, everyone else can see that I'm looking at it and they can get to it first. But being able to tell the direction of a gaze is important for cooperative societies, because if you want to be quiet during a hunt, you can just look this way and you're communicating which way you're looking. So I can't go through all of the evidence, but this is just a little tiny sample of the evidence as to how during Homo sapiens evolutionary history, we had a higher degree of cooperation than lots of our animal relatives. And that's, here's one more interesting bit. So this is getting into the next part. I'm going to show some disgusting pictures. They've found when you I think it's a CT scan is what they use, but basically they're looking at activity in the brain, what part of the brain is lighting up. So they showed people these disgusting photos, and they looked at their brains, how their brains lit up. And the people who had the strongest reaction in the amygdala, I think, where fear or disgust is processed, those people tended to be on the right side of the political spectrum. And the brain's reaction to these photos here was a better predictor of that person's political ideology than knowing the political ideology of that person's parents. That's pretty crazy, because there's a strong correlation between the partisan identity, like Republican or Democrat, of one person and that person's parents. But they found that the way that the brain reacted to these kinds of photos was an even better predictor of whether you were on the right or the left, which is kind of crazy. But basically what the research shows is that we have these different psychological tendencies. For instance, one thing is a need for cognitive closure. That is, how much do we need to feel like we understand things, there aren't any open questions, there aren't any unsolved puzzles, we know exactly how things operate. Some people desire that more than others. Some people really want to have a clear picture and believe that they understand things perfectly. Other people are more accepting of, look, this is a complex system, we can't know it perfectly, there are always going to be unsolved mysteries and puzzles, etc. Well, people higher in need for cognitive closure tend to be more on the right, and people lower in need for cognitive closure tend to be on the left. So what this suggests is that these variations in psychological traits incline people or attract people towards one or the other side of the ideological spectrum. So that's one part of the demand side biases, what these psychological tendencies that might draw us more to the right or to the left. But in general, we have a species history where our greater ability to cooperate is really what made Homo sapiens so successful. We were able to cooperate so we could hunt big game. If we were all competitive individualists, we would not be able to kill a woolly mammoth. They would kill us every day. It doesn't matter how brilliant we were, how big and tough we were. But cooperatively, we could, and we did, hunt, the largest prey on the planet. So we have that relatively newer kind of suite of psychological characteristics, and it's called in the literature the Egalitarian Syndrome, that we get angry when people are trying to abuse us or abuse other people. We actually experience pleasure when those people are punished, people who are trying to dominate others. But we also have the kind of more traditional, animalistic, competitive selfishness, where the nature is red in tooth and claw. It's all about competition and dominance. So we have some of that in our history, but we also have this egalitarian syndrome. So this might be the origin of the kind of left-right split. So in general, what I call left psychology is a lot of different psychological traits, but you can kind of summarize them in their results. And the result is that left psychology wants change. They want reform or revolution. They want something different. They want improvement. And it's anti-hierarchy. It's more attuned to the egalitarian syndrome of our evolved psychology. Whereas right psychology resists change. They see more value in the way things currently are, more value in the status quo, and they're more pro-hierarchy. They're more accepting of inequality. So what this could do in the long term, having half of people in general inclined towards the right and half of people in general inclined towards the left, it might be what is called in the evolutionary theory literature an evolutionarily stable strategy. So you start off with the right preserving the status quo, the left pushes for some change, introduces some novelty. If the left wins, then the right preserves that new status quo, plus the novelty that the left introduced. And then if the left loses, then the novelty is rejected and the status quo is preserved. So this might be a way to basically allow for social evolution and progress without allowing it to go too crazily fast. So if the left is always winning, and this is not any given country's left, this is the kind of the psychological left, broad left, wanting change and rejecting hierarchy. So then they would introduce a novelty. If it wins, the right then preserves that novelty. If they fail, then the pre-existing status quo continues. So that's the kind of the background to the split in our psychology. But then something that we basically all share in common are all of these social psychological biases. So we tend to think, it feels when we're reasoning like a wise judge, like this guy here. But social psychology suggests that instead, the way that our brains reason is more like a sleazy lawyer who has a client and he has to come up with good arguments to get his client off of the charges or allow his client to win in the civil suits or what have you. All this time, it feels like we're being perfectly impartial, but our brains didn't evolve to be impartial. Our brains evolved to come up with very effective rationalizations for whatever we believe or whatever might be in our interest or group interest. But we don't see it that way. We experience our reasoning process as if we're being perfectly logical and rational. But in reality, we're very biased in our thinking, and we have to actively act against our natural way of thinking in order to approximate the impartial judge. So you've got this cartoon illustrating what you might have heard of confirmation bias. When we have beliefs, we tend to look for information that will confirm our beliefs instead of doing the kind of the more rationally appropriate thing, which is if we have a belief, we should look for information that contradicts our belief, that disproves it. That's what scientists do. If you have a hypothesis, you design an experiment that can disprove your hypothesis. So the whole scientific method is operating against our natural way of thinking, which is to do the opposite. You have a hypothesis and you try to prove that hypothesis rather than disprove it. Another thing we do is we have a belief, We tend to ignore evidence that goes against our belief. And we'll find the one little bit of evidence that supports our belief, and then we'll close our ears and shut our eyes and try to stay in a bubble with like-minded people. And this sounds very familiar because social media is full of this. Yeah. That's how fake news spreads. You get a belief that makes you feel good because it matches what you already believe, and then you have other people.
And some social media, FB, Instagram, something like that, YouTube, you read, watch what you want. Show the video that you feel interested.
Yeah, and it feels good. It actively, it feels painful when a belief of ours is challenged. So I would hope that kids are taught, if you're going to be thinking politically, you have to accept that you're going to feel bad a lot of the times, because anytime your belief is challenged, your brain is going to react as if you have just been physically hurt. So you have to get over that and expect that and learn how to deal with that feeling of discomfort. But I think people are generally not taught that. They go with their feelings, and their feelings incline them to only read news that already supports their pre-existing beliefs. And whenever they're presented with something that challenges their beliefs, they tend to shut down, or you'll unfriend somebody on Facebook when they challenge your beliefs. So that's the way our brains naturally operate. Another really important psychological bias for politics is intergroup bias, or in-group bias, or groupishness. And this cartoon is one of my favorite cartoons because it's a perfect illustration of in-group bias.
This good meme.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then somebody improved it and made it even better. So they add, we have our objective news, our combating disinformation. When they do it, it's their state propaganda, their censorship of the truth. And this is just we can understand this bias very well from an evolutionary perspective. Intergroup bias is excellent at making groups cohere more strongly, to make groups more unified. We like the people in our groups more than we like people in other groups, and that helps us cooperate better in our groups. And in general, in-group bias is stronger than out-group bias. So in general, we have stronger positive feelings for people in our group than we have negative feelings for people outside of our group. However, when there's a situation of perceived competition for scarce resources, then out-group bias can become just as strong, if not stronger, as in-group bias. So that's becomes dangerous. We can see that in the US, we can see that in Europe. Why is there so much anti-immigrant sentiment? Well, we've had inequality going up over the past few decades, so perceived competition over scarce resources is higher, and that is the perfect environment for out-group bias to become stronger. And so, it's the immigrants. We have to get the immigrants out. That's a perfect illustration of intergroup bias in the real world. We also have memory biases. So we tend to remember the information that supports our existing beliefs or makes our group feel good, and we tend to forget the information that makes our group look bad or makes us feel bad. And one small example of this was in 2013, they did a survey in the UK asking people for their estimate as to how many people died as a result of the Iraq War, which of course the UK was part of the coalition of the willing invading. So if you see, very few people guessed that it was over 1 million or between 500,000 and 1 million people. The plurality of people, the majority of people thought it was less than 10,000 people. 10,000 people who died. This is 2013. Now the actual scientific estimates there was a Lancet study that used epidemiological methods and estimated over 1 million people. There was a PLOS medicine study also using epidemiological methods, estimated about 500,000. And then there was even, this is not really scientific, but there was the Iraqi body count estimate. And that just counted newspaper and other media reports of violent deaths and just added them all up. And of course, that's hardly scientific because not every person who dies violently is going to be included in a media report. But you get you can see the comparison of the actual estimates that had been in the media. There had been media attention to these, but nonetheless, people persisted to drastically underestimate. Now that could be because one of two reasons. These estimates did not get wide and sustained media coverage, especially in the right-wing British press. Why would they cover this? This makes the in-group look bad. That makes the UK look bad. So they might have mentioned this in passing if they even mentioned it at all. Maybe some of the more liberal media outlets would have covered these, but even if people learned about these estimates, because of our psychological biases, we would be more likely to forget about these estimates or just discount them. I don't know if you remember that, but at the time, a lot of people in the West all of a sudden became armchair philosophers of science. And they started critiquing the whole field of epidemiology and their methods. Well, that's because the methods used produced knowledge, these estimates of people killed, that made people feel bad. They didn't want to believe that the war that they supported might have resulted in 500,000 or 1 million innocent people dying. So what do? Well, attack the methods. Oh, this epidemiological method is very poor. It's going to result in an overestimate. So that's another example of our psychological biases. Then we've got the example of belief persistence. We've got this cartoon where you have a snail looking at a tape dispenser, and apparently one of them thought that it was a female snail, so he fell in love. But then the other snail said, no, it's a tape dispenser. And he says, I don't care if she is a tape dispenser, I still love her. So that's belief persistence. And the way that social psychologists have found this to operate, they did this really brilliant study where they gave people a fake case study that proved that risky firefighters were better than firefighters that were more cautious. So they said, read this study. The risk-taking firefighters are more effective firefighters. And then they asked people to write, why they believe this was true. So people would sit down, they would think, oh, well, a risk-taking firefighter would make quicker decisions. So they would enter the burning building faster. And so they would be able to save more people that way. Fear wouldn't affect them so much because they're risk takers. So this is why risk-taking firefighters must be better firefighters. And think back to schemas. These beliefs are encoded in our brains in a neuronal network. So we've got the belief, risk-taking firefighters are better. That's connected to the belief that, they enter burning buildings faster. That's connected to the belief that fear doesn't prevent them from taking quick action. That's connected to the belief that they save more people. Then, and then there's more beliefs. They're less likely to marry, so they spend more time working, and that's how they can save people. They drive faster, so they get to the fire faster. Anyway, then the people in the study were told, you know what? That study we gave you, it's entirely fake. It's not true. There is no evidence for risk-taking firefighters being better firefighters. We just made that up. Then they let some time pass and they asked the people, what do you think the relationship between risk-taking and being a good firefighter is? And they continued to believe that risk-taking firefighters were better firefighters. So they had to explain, why is this happening? They were just told that the study we gave them was completely fake. So why do they still believe this? And the explanation they have is, well, they still had all of these beliefs. They created a schematic network, a neuronal network, encoding all of these related beliefs to this case study. So once you get rid of the belief that this case study is true, you still have all of these related beliefs. And of course, that we can, I think, see is directly related to politics. Because when a piece of fake news goes around, people absorb that information, they fit it into their neuronal network, they have all of these related beliefs, and even if they're told, that news was fake, it doesn't change their beliefs much because they have all of these connected beliefs that don't go away just because you tell them that something is fake. Then we've got system justification, cognitive conservatism. System justification is kind of like the Stockholm syndrome. Yeah.
Well.
Exactly. So it's like when people realize that the system that they live in is unjust, Like say you're a poor working class person in the US. If you learn about how the system really works, you're going to feel horrible because you realize that you're at the bottom of a terribly unjust system. That's a painful realization. So that psychological pain itself motivates people to come up with some justification. So instead of acknowledging that the system that they live in is unjust, they come up with rationalizations that are less painful. So they might say, oh, you know what? It's my fault. When I was in school, I didn't study hard enough. I didn't study the right thing. I went into the wrong job. I spent too much time with my family or with my friends. You come up with ways to justify the system so that you get rid of that painful recognition. And I talked to the psychologist who came up with this whole theory, and he said, yeah, this was inspired by Marx's idea of false consciousness. He was trying to explain how it could be that so many people at the bottom of an unjust system could nonetheless believe that the system is fair. And so they do all sorts of fascinating experiments that demonstrate that this is exactly what's going on. It's the painfulness of the recognition that the system you're in is unjust that motivates people to come up with rationalizations, and that makes them feel better. Lastly, the cognitive conservatism. There's a lot of ways our brain works to simply preserve our pre-existing beliefs. It's very difficult to get people to change their whole belief structure. Once we have a belief structure, there's a lot of ways that our psychology works to maintain those beliefs. And one reason is it's just a lot of effort to change our whole belief structure. You know, it's like it takes actual energy to reprogram, to reform our neural networks. It's not like this is cost-free. It actually takes energy and effort, and it's experienced as a painful process. Like if you ever meet someone who has gone from left to right or right to left, who has had a total conversion or even a religious conversion, they'll probably tell you that it was a painful process to go through. That's the result of our cognitive conservatism. Okay, now going into the media, like the intersection between supply and demand biases. A lot of people will say that the media is the infrastructure of democracy, and certainly in the US you've got a lot of problems because newspapers have been disappearing all over the country. The number of jobs in journalism has been falling crazily, and online news is not making up for it. But there are people like this NPR journalist, Brooke Gladstone, who wrote this comic book. And it's a serious comic book, though. She's trying to argue that, no, the media isn't influencing what people believe. Instead, people have pre-existing beliefs, and those create preferences for media, and those preferences create the media that they want. So it's like the market is demanding a right-wing media, and so entrepreneurs create a right-wing media to meet market demand. And that is part of the story, certainly. Market demand does influence what the media offers, but that, I think, has it entirely backwards. Because you have to ask yourself, where did these beliefs come from? How did people have a right-wing or a left-wing perspective on politics in the first place? You're not born with this. This isn't encoded in our genes. We have to learn about it first from somewhere. So I think she has it basically backwards, and I'll get into some of the research. So you've got this cultivation differential. It's a fascinating area of research where all they do is they ask people, how much TV do you watch every week? And they separate people into high television viewers and low television viewers. And then they ask them all sorts of questions. And what's fascinating is they find a significant difference between people who watch a lot of television and people who watch a little bit of television. One thing is, heavy viewers think the world is a much more dangerous place than light television viewers. Because when you watch a lot of TV, you're seeing a lot of violent cop shows. You think, oh my God, the world is such a violent, dangerous place. People who don't watch a lot of TV, they're in the real world. They see that actually the world's not so dangerous. I wonder if this would work in Hong Kong too. It might.
Yeah. It looks like similar. It's very similar. It's like we have maybe perhaps the same some historical family issues, like most families in Hong Kong, their parents or their grandparents were from mainland China, and they escaped from the communist China, so they may think that, okay, communist is a bad guy. They have some pre-information about this one. Then we have some media keep telling that communists are bad, communists is bad, communists is bad, then it's reinforcing such belief.
Yeah, I mean, as a United Statesian moving here, Hong Kong seemed to me like the Miami of Asia, because in the Americas, Miami is a place where a lot of right-wing dictators will send their money, they'll send their children, they'll move to Miami after they retire. People on the right throughout the Americas move to Miami. They love Miami. So in Miami, you have a lot of anti-communist Americans from all over the Americas. And it seemed like Hong Kong was somewhat similar in that respect, in that, you know, a lot of people who, as you said, were leaving the mainland because of the revolution, Vietnam as well. So you have a lot of people who have that ideology already, who come here, and so you have kind of, that is part of the ecology of information, pre-existing beliefs about communism that are negative. So that's certainly a big part of the ecology of information, and it goes to like the demand for certain kinds of media. But in general, you see a lot of interesting differences between people who watch a lot of TV and watch just a little bit of TV. And here, politically relevant stuff, I guess all of this is politically relevant, but down here, people who watch a lot of TV were more misinformed about the Gulf War in the early 1990s and more supportive of violent foreign policy. And people who didn't watch so much TV were better informed. So it shows one of the media effects of watching US mass media. But in terms of media effects, the most commonly researched kinds of media effects are these three. So priming is the ability of the media to call attention to one aspect of an issue, one aspect of a politician, and make people think of that aspect instead of many other possible aspects of the same issue. So for instance, if the media focuses on like a sex scandal for a given politician, just because they focus on that, they are priming that, so that when people think of that politician, they'll think of that sex scandal instead of thinking of many other possible things, like what is that politician's record? What are the policies that politician supports? If the media focuses on some of the policies that politician supports, then they prime those considerations rather than other considerations. So that's one kind of effect that the media can have. Another one is agenda setting. The media sets our agenda. The media chooses what topics to cover and what topics not to cover. And by doing that, they're said to set the agenda. So people, when they get together among friends or co-workers or what have you, they'll tend to talk about the same issues that the media brings up. So the media has set the agenda for the political conversations that people have. And then lastly, framing. So, take the example I was using before, the Iraq War. The media can frame that issue in many different ways. The dominant framing in the US was 9/11. The US was attacked on 9/11. This war on Iraq is framed as a response to 9/11. Saddam Hussein is framed as someone who supports Al-Qaeda. He might have been working with Al-Qaeda. He's framed as someone who might have weapons of mass destruction. That's very much related to 9/11. That's the framing. But framing can be done in many, many ways. It could have been done as, the US foreign policy for most of US history has been very belligerent. It's been, the main goal has been to maximize power, to gain control of resources. So the Iraq War could have been framed in that way. It could have been, look at all of these historical examples. The overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran, so that he wouldn't nationalize the Iranian oil. Well, this is just like what's happening right now. The US government wants to dominate the supply of oil in Iraq. That could have been framed in that manner. But this is an example of the influence that the media has, the power to frame an issue one way rather than another. So a great example of the power of media to affect how people think about politics, Media Tenor, sadly they don't seem to be in business anymore, but they did great research where they had people coding the tenor of media coverage. So you'd get a bunch of people in a room, you'd watch television coverage, and you'd say, you know, how positive was this coverage towards George W. Bush? How positive was it towards John Kerry during the 2004 election? So the yellow line indicates whether it was more favorable towards Bush or more favorable towards Kerry. And then the red and the blue bars is showing the polling on who is going to win the election, Bush or Kerry. And what you see pretty clearly is the polls follow the media coverage. When media coverage towards Bush is pro-Bush, polling is in favor of Bush. When media coverage turns negative on Bush and positive towards Kerry, then Kerry starts to lead in the polls. But then when media coverage returns to being more pro-Bush, polls go more towards Bush. This is very recent research. This just came out, I think, last year. And it shows basically increases in mortality linked to which Fox News program people were watching. This is a brilliant natural experiment. So I don't know if you know, but in March of last year, you had the Tucker Carlson show. He started to treat coronavirus as an actual threat. On the other main Fox show, Sean Hannity, he was saying, oh, coronavirus is a joke, it's just like the flu. The Democrats are trying to use this to attack Trump. They're trying to win the election by making a big deal about this coronavirus, but it's not a big deal, don't worry about it. So at the same time, you had Sean Hannity saying that, and Tucker Carlson saying, actually, no, this is not a joke. This is something worrisome, it's dangerous. So what they did is they used a natural experiment. I won't get into too many of the details, but some people turned on their TV and saw Tucker Carlson, other people turned on their TV and saw Sean Hannity. And they could trace higher death rates that could be linked just to watching Sean Hannity rather than Tucker Carlson. That is a powerful media effect. So this is an illustration of how powerful the media can be, because you're a person that trusts Fox News. You turn on your TV, you see a guy saying, hey, don't worry about this. This is just a Democratic propaganda point. They're trying to hurt Trump's re-election campaign. And other people, when they turned on their TV at the same time, they would hear Tucker Carlson say, oh no, this is actually something worrisome. You should do social distancing. You should wear masks. So those people who got that message tended to be less likely to get coronavirus and die compared to people watching Sean Hannity.
Well, perhaps Trump didn't watch Tucker.
Apparently he's a big fan of both of them. So another aspect of media effects, and I think this is probably the most pernicious and the most powerful, is just omission. It's not what the media does present, it's what the media does not present. So those cartoons I showed you earlier about US foreign policy and about Obama, the reason why so many people in the US just would not get those cartoons is because the media has omitted the information that is required to understand why that is a funny critique or a biting critique of US foreign policy. They just wouldn't get it. One of the first political comedians in the US, Bill Hicks, he would do he was kind of a trailblazer in political comedy. And of course, political comedians tend to be on the left because it's really hard to do right-wing political comedy because it has to be true and surprising. Anyhow, he would try these political humor at comedy clubs in the US, and people would just look at him like, no, I don't get it. And so he thought, oh man, I'm a failure. I'm a failure as a comedian. Then he did a show in Canada, same material, and people were cracking up. Then he went to the UK. He became extremely popular. Australia, extremely popular. And that's when he realized that. He said, when I do these jokes in the US, it's like showing a dog a card trick. A dog is not going to find a card trick interesting because it lacks the contextual information to understand why a card trick is amazing or magical. Same thing with political humor with American audiences or US audiences. They don't know much about their countries, their government's foreign policy. So these jokes that are critiquing it don't make any sense to them. But people outside of the US are more likely to understand, to have this information. So that's the problem of omission. And as this cartoon shows very well, if you're only focusing on one aspect of reality and you omit other aspects, it might look like, you know, the aggressor is the victim and vice versa. So anyhow, how am I doing on time?
What's the time right now? Sorry. It's 5 minutes past 12, but we can keep going. It's very interesting.
Oh, okay. Well,
Don't worry about time. Yeah, just going.
Okay, I'm getting closer to the end. This now is I'll get into a little bit about the political economy of media. So why are there these supply side biases in the U.S. media system? There isn't a censorship department. Journalists are free to say what they like. Journalists are often adversarial towards government. So how can it be that there are supply side biases? Well, this is the way that you know, in democratic theory, democracy is supposed to work. So you've got the people, all of the people. They engage in free debate in the public sphere, you know, in workplaces, in homes, in clubs, wherever, you know, online. We're debating all the time. That shapes public opinion, and then public opinion influences elected representatives, and vice versa. Elected representatives influence public opinion, they influence the debate in the public sphere. That's how it's supposed to work. But basically what you have in the US today is you've got media companies dominating the public sphere, because now the public sphere is all mediatized. It's either on the internet or on TV or on radio. So the original idea of the public sphere, Jürgen Habermas wrote about the history of the public sphere, is that you would have these salons and coffee shops in Europe, and you would have people of all walks of life reading newspapers and books and then debating about politics. And this experience was one of the main reasons why the idea of democracy was able to defeat the old status quo, that you needed to have an aristocracy, because it's only the aristocracy that could be trusted to implement wise political policy. The experience of the salons, of having people from all walks of life capable of having intelligent political debate, that was a big reason why democracy was viewed as something that was actually possible. So today, however, instead of having, you know, free debate in salons and coffee shops, we've got the TV, where it's a one-way flow of communication. Recently, however, because of the development of the internet, you have something that looks a little bit more like the old public sphere, the old salons and coffee shops where you could debate politics. However, even on the internet, that space is still dominated, at least in the US, by the same old legacy media companies. Your NBCs, your New York Times, your Washington Post, your MSNBCs, your Fox News, etc. That is still the dominant player in the online media space. And of course, you've got a massive degree of concentration and ownership of media in the United States. So back in, 1983, 90% of the American media was owned by 50 some odd companies. Today, it's basically 6. So I would say to people in Hong Kong, you know, if you're looking for investment to try to reduce political problems in the world, I looked up the market capitalization of News Corp a couple weeks ago. It's $13.5 billion when I looked at it. You can raise some $20 billion and do a hostile takeover of News Corp and turn it into a proper democracy-appropriate media outlet. That would be fantastic. So, you know, think of these companies if you want to actually make some political change and reduce the amount of jingoism and nationalism in the US. The problem is right here, that the masses of the people in the US are not exposed to alternative perspectives. They only get the right-wing Democratic perspective or the right-wing Republican perspective. And you can find other perspectives, but you need leisure, you need education to know where on the internet to go. A lot of people do find that out, but certainly nowhere near a majority, and that's the problem. So when it comes to freedom of speech, you've got a variety of thinkers making basically the same point. And that is, it's all well and good to have freedom of speech protected in the Constitution. So I can go out onto a street corner in New York and scream my head off about whatever I want to say, and I'm not going to be thrown in jail. But what good is that when the means of communication are inaccessible to people? So yes, you can shout on a street corner. What is that going to do? Nothing. Because the way that the modern means of communication are set up, they're TV, they're radio, they're internet websites that get millions and millions of hits, they're YouTube, they're what's shared on social media, who controls the algorithms. That is the means of communication today. And so if you do not have a right to access the means of communication, what is the purpose of or what is the effect of your right to free speech? It's like, shouting into a cave, shouting into an empty room. It has no effect. Then you've got all sorts of problems on the supply side. So this cartoon is basically just illustrating the problems of having a commercial media system. When your media system is predominantly commercial, when all media outlets are profit-making enterprises, then your actual customer is not your reader, is not your viewer. Your actual customer is your advertiser, your sponsor. The business model is you attract eyeballs, you attract viewers and readers, and then you sell them to the advertiser. So the advertiser has a great deal of power and influence over what you present. Another aspect. So here you have a frustrated news reader saying, just tell me the truth, and then the media saying, I can't, I've got too many sponsors. So that's similar to the point I was making before, but then the last little bit you might not be able to read here is, plus you couldn't take it. This gets into the demand of news viewers. If you turn on the news and you have a very complicated presentation, a lot of information is being presented. You're a busy person. You have to take care of your kids. You're worried about work. You might just turn the channel. Let me just watch something that's more pleasant. Let me watch some sports or a soap opera or something. And that, for commercial media, is something that they have to avoid. So they have to avoid complicated issues. They have to avoid issues that will make people feel bad. If there's a report about how the US military is committing war crimes in Afghanistan, well, you know that that's going to make your audience feel bad. So you might want to avoid that and give them something that will make them feel better, because then they'll stay on your channel. So that's another aspect of bias. Then there's sensationalism. You've got, this is an important story about an oil spill and a corporation trying to cover it up. And then someone who isn't that interested in politics saying, are there sex videos of the oil regulators with the oil executives? No, sensationalism. Sensationalism sells. So you have the motivation on the part of media outlets to go with something sensational, something that will attract eyeballs, instead of something that's actually more politically important, something that's essential for citizens to know. Then you've got ideological bias. Most of the time when people think about problems in the media system, they think of bias, like, the journalists themselves they have a liberal bias, or the journalists have a right-wing bias. But you have a more important bias, what I've been talking about, and that's the bias to make money. So whatever that results in, more sensationalism, less complicated presentations of what's going on, news that won't make people feel bad, like news that makes their in-group, their country, their government look bad. That's, I think, the most important form of bias. But you also have, the actual ideological bias of journalists, and that's pretty clear. What's happened, one thing that I didn't write about enough in my book, which I was kind of kicking myself for, because
You have another chance to write another book.
I don't know if I have another book in me. Because Matt Taibbi kind of did this for me. He wrote a book recently called Hate Incorporated. And he's basically just writing about how the business model of the mass media in the US has changed over the past decade or so. So Fox News came out, and it was a very clear pro-Republican, conservative, very biased media outlet. But it was very profitable. It attracted a lot of eyeballs because people like having their beliefs confirmed. They like not having to hear any information that challenges them and makes them feel bad. So what happened in the media market was MSNBC, CNN saw, this is how you make money in the new market. So they then became, or kind of evolved into, the liberal or the Democrat version of Fox News. So that you have, instead of trying to present a middle-of-the-road kind of presentation of the news, you have this bifurcation of Fox on the right here, giving people on the right what they want to hear, and then CNN and MSNBC giving people on the liberal side, the Democrat side, what they want to hear. And so you have, that's the main cause of political polarization. As someone wrote an article about, they titled the article, "It's the media, stupid." That's it. Don't go, you don't have to go too deep into long-winded explanations. It's the media that is the number one cause of the degree of political polarization in the United States today. But you do have a bias sort of within journalists overall. And it's very, you can find books that say, oh, the media is biased in a liberal direction. But you can also find books that say, no, the media is biased in a conservative direction. It's actually, they're talking past each other. Because the evidence does show that most journalists working in the US are more liberal on social issues. So when it comes to gay rights, most journalists are in favor of gay rights. There are fewer journalists who take the kind of conservative Christian view that homosexuality is something from the devil, and it's always a sin, and it's a conspiracy by Satan, etc. Very few journalists believe that. Most of them are in favor of gay rights. On social issues, they're liberal. But when it comes to foreign policy, and I don't have a cartoon for this, but, oh no, I do have a cartoon after this. When it comes to foreign policy, most journalists are more conservative. They tend to accept what the government tells them about foreign policy. So when it came to the Iraq War, did you see a lot of criticism of the Bush administration's case for war? No, not in the mass media. You could find it in the fringe left-wing media, sure. Also in the paleo-conservative media, yeah. But for the masses, they only saw essentially pro-war media. And part of this is the concept of embedded journalism, where the military allows journalists to tag along with a tank crew or go along with a platoon of soldiers. So you've got that problem. And then you've got this one about economic coverage. So surveys have found that most journalists are economically conservative. They're worried about the deficit and the debt, except when it comes to military spending. That's magical. You don't have to worry about the debt and deficit when you're spending on weapons for some reason. So you have bias in coverage from the journalist's own ideology when it comes to covering economic stories, unions, strikes, economic policies that would benefit the working class and tax the wealthy. So you do have a little bit of ideological bias on the part of journalists themselves, but that's basically a right-wing bias on economics and foreign policy and a liberal bias on social issues. To organize all of these various supply-side biases, probably the most helpful model is the propaganda model that was, I think, first introduced by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky in the book Manufacturing Consent. And there's basically 5 pillars. You've got the size of media corporations, the ownership and the profit orientation. I've mentioned that already, but one extra thing is, for instance, NBC used to be owned by General Electric. So General Electric produces a lot of weapons. They produce nuclear power plants. The nature of the ownership is such that if you're a journalist working for NBC and you have a story about, say, safety issues at nuclear power plants, you might be thinking in the back of your head, you know, if I do a story that's very negative on nuclear power, somebody at General Electric might call my boss and get me into trouble. So I might want to stay away from that story. That's kind of the bias there. The influence exerted by advertisers, I've mentioned that already. Source bias, I haven't mentioned that. That's a really key thing. If you're a journalist, rather if you're a manager at a for-profit media company, there's many ways that you can get information for a story. Let's say it's a story involving something in another country, like foreign affairs, a war, a potential war. Well, you could send your journalist to that country. You're going to need to pay for their airfare, per diem, hotel, insurance, security. That's an expensive proposition.
Yeah.
However, if you just send them down to the other side of town to the State Department, go to a press conference, the State Department is going to give them a nice fat book full of all the information the State Department thinks is relevant. You just sit there, you listen to the State Department's presentation, you read their fact sheet. Now you can write a story. And that State Department source is an official source, a high-ranking source. So that's viewed as, you know, a legitimate source. If you were, as a journalist, you're saying, okay, well, I know that I should include what the government is saying, but I also want to find other perspectives. Well, what if there's nobody in government who has an anti-war stance? Well, where am I going to go? Do I go to a left-wing political group? Do I go to a university and find some professor who's against the war? Well, if I do that, they're not official sources. It's going to look like I'm following my own bias, and I'm trying to find some source that agrees with me. That doesn't look good. That's not an official source. So that's source bias. Just by nature of what sources are viewed as official, what sources are viewed as important, that in itself can influence media coverage. Again, it's omission. What voices are we not hearing? What perspectives are we not encountering? Then there's flack. That's pressure groups organizing to put pressure on media outlets and journalists themselves. So, you know, right-wing pro-Israeli government organizations will often pressure media outlets whenever there's coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that makes the IDF look bad, the Israeli Defense Forces look bad, or the Israeli government look bad. That's an example of flack. Or, but basically any organized pressure group can do this. Saudi money and Gulf state money is huge in DC. They spend so much money donating to think tanks, but spending on lobbying. So, you know, if there's any sort of story on Saudi Arabia, they're going to be all over that. They're going to be pressuring the media outlets to try to soften the image of Saudi. You saw that a couple of years ago with all of these puff pieces about Mohammed bin Salman, the new crown prince. So all these stories in the media about how he's a bold reformer. That's an example of flack. That's positive flack. That's promoting things. There's also negative flack. When you don't like the coverage, you say, hey, we're going to boycott the advertisers on this program until you change your coverage. And then lastly, you have the ideology of journalists themselves, which I already talked about a little bit. And then there's a sixth thing. Occasionally, you have direct governmental influence on media coverage. So this is much more in the kind of traditional propaganda realm. So during the lead up to the Iraq War, if you remember Judith Miller at the New York Times, she was getting leaks from the Pentagon. They were basically giving her fake intelligence about, you know, Iraq trying to buy uranium, and she was just reprinting that as, oh, I've got a source in the government. Like, look, Iraq is trying to buy weapons of mass destruction. That's direct government influence on what appears in the media. If you look up the Church Committee hearings in the 1970s, they uncovered that the CIA at the time had people in every single major media outlet. You know, the Associated Press, New York Times, ABC, NBC, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. they had either not an agent directly, but they had somebody that they had a direct line to. So they could say, hey, I hear you're going to run a story on U.S. government support for death squads in Colombia, let's say. Let's change this a little bit, because this is a matter of national security. So you do have direct government interference, but it's not, as far as we know, to the extent of total control. It's more like significant influence. I mentioned the problems of the news media, that newspapers are dying. And this is a major problem because I forget his name, but the guy who directed the TV series The Wire, David Simon, I think, he said, we are in like heavenly days for local government corruption. It's going to be a wonderful time to be a corrupt mayor, etc., because now we don't have so many journalists around. All of these local newspapers are disappearing. So it's going to be a great time to be a corrupt local politician, because you're not going to have any journalists who can uncover your corruption. And that is a major problem with the news media today. So the overall message I'm trying to impart here is that the media is an incredibly powerful force in politics. It is the primary force shaping what people believe about politics. It influences what people know about politics, and more importantly, what they don't know. You had this conservative Catholic intellectual, G.K. Chesterton, who made a really brilliant insight about media. And he said, the blackest lie, the worst, most evil lie, is not untrue. It's not even a half-truth. The blackest lie is completely true. But what makes it the blackest lie is what it doesn't include. He said, give me the power to decide what is included and what is excluded, and I can do anything I want. I don't even have to lie. I can be telling complete truths all of the time, but I just choose what to exclude, and that's what makes something the most pernicious lie, the most dangerous lie. So the US media is the most important force in the ecology of information. What are people likely to know about politics? It's what is presented in the mass media. Why are our political elections turning out the way that they are in the US? Look no further than the media that millions of people are accessing. Not tens of thousands, not even hundreds of thousands. Look at the media outlets that millions of people are tuning into, and that is your number one reason why elections are turning out the way they're turning out, why polls find what they find. The media is the most powerful player in the ecology of information in the United States, by far. And lastly, what is the most powerful influence on the media? It is groups that have a disproportionate amount of power. That's mainly financial power, but it's also political power. When it comes to foreign policy, it's not just people with wealth power, it's people with political power, people in think tanks in DC, people in the Pentagon. But in general, it's what is the most influential force operating on the media? It's the power that wealth confers. It's wealthy investors, it's heads of corporations, and then how they influence the producers of ideas. They fund think tanks. Think tanks produce ideas that then get disseminated down to journalists themselves, and then from journalists themselves, they get disseminated down to the masses of people. The right in the US is much better organized on this, much more intelligent, to be honest. There's a whole history of this. You could read a book called Messengers of the Right. There's also, I'm forgetting the name of the book right now. It's a book about how during the Great Depression, the right was totally destroyed. Their beliefs about a free market system were untenable. The Great Depression just wiped out their ideology altogether. Nobody was dumb enough to believe in laissez-faire capitalism by 1935. And they knew that. They recognized that. They recognized that they had lost. So they organized into groups, and they realized this is going to be a long fight. We need to fund think tanks. We need to fund university chairs. And from the universities and from the think tanks, we're going to get ideas out into the media. And then from the media, we'll get out these ideas to the masses. And that is precisely what they did. And there is nothing equivalent on the left in the United States. A, because there aren't so many left-wing billionaires. Left-wingers tend not to be billionaires. But there's just nothing like that. There's nothing equivalent to that on the left. Okay, so comparing media systems, this, I think I can just skip past this because, I mean, when you're designing a media system that's appropriate for a true democratic system, you've got to avoid the dangers of propaganda and PAP. So propaganda would be just the government telling people exactly what to believe, telling media exactly what to write. I don't think that's very effective either because it's obvious. People can see through that and then they'll choose to believe the exact opposite of that, which doesn't do anyone any good. Then, of course, the problems of PAP, just fluff, worthless, garbage media coverage. That's what I've been talking about with the United States. So there's a lot of studies in comparative media, and essentially what they find across the board is that public service media, media that is financed by the government, by the taxpayer, that kind of media does a better job across the board of informing people. Commercial media, as I said before, their main purpose is to make money. If they happen to also inform people about politics, okay, great, but that's not the purpose. Whatever makes money is the purpose. And so the presentations of the political world that you see in the commercial media in many countries simply don't do as good of a job as state-funded media, where the government says, okay, here's the money you journalists need to do your job, now do it. You don't have to worry about attracting a big audience. You don't have to worry about outside influences. You don't have to worry about advertisers being offended. You don't have to worry about flack, people getting offended and writing in and saying, we're going to boycott you. Who cares? I'm still going to get my paycheck. We're still going to have the resources to do our job, and that ends up doing a better job than commercial media. So then there's a lot of suggestions for how to make an ideal media system. This is one of them, but I've been going on a little bit past the hour, so I think I'll just skip past this and just open it up to questions. But basically,
this is the most important part. We would like to.
Oh, okay, then I'll discuss it briefly. Like, I forget, I think it might have been James Curran who came up with this, but lots of people discussed, what would an ideal media system look like. So they'd say, look, you can keep the private sector, let them sink or swim. Fine, if you want commercial media, let them do whatever they want, but use content regulations to make sure that you don't have these echo chambers like Fox News, where you can tune in and never have your ideology challenged. Or like MSNBC, where you tune in and you never hear from alternative perspectives. That's dangerous. So you do have content regulations, but fine. If you want a private media system, great, whatever. Then you also have a civic sector. And that in Holland, they've been doing this for a long while, where they give government grants to different, what they call pillars of society, like the labor movement, the Catholics, the Protestants, different large social groups, and they get government grants to do their own media. Then you'd have the professional sector. That would be like the BBC or Al Jazeera model, where it's government funded. You hire good journalists. You say, here's the money. You do your thing. We're not going to twist your arm or influence you too much. Unfortunately, the BBC recently has become less and less like this. There's been more government influence on the BBC. Al Jazeera in English, I think, is still pretty good. Al Jazeera Arabic apparently is pretty horrendous. It's like a very Sunni supremacist news presentation. But the model is basically the same. Or Telesur in South America. That's the basic model. Then you could have the social market sector. In the Scandinavian countries, you have countries where they give grants to political minorities or ethnic minorities so they can have media in their own language or from their own group perspective. And then lastly, public service TV. The model in Germany, I think, provides a good example. So you have speech access granted to all ideological perspectives. Now, the key thing here is making sure that you're getting all legitimate political perspectives, not just crazy people with the belief that the world is flat and so or aliens rule the world. You don't have to give space to everybody. You might also have hate speech restrictions, like Nazis are not allowed to have their own time, because you make bright line laws that say if you're advocating hatred towards an ethnic group, sorry, that's not included. But all legitimate, and this is where it becomes important to determine what exactly is a legitimate political perspective. But there you give speech access so that on the major TV news programs, everyone gets to debate. So that's like the broad outline of a ideal media system in my view. Lastly, you've got this quote. Yeah, you've got this quote attributed to Napoleon. This is the power of the media. Like going back to the
French Revolution.
Yeah. And even before that, the acme of skill is to win a war without fighting a single battle. That's what you can do with media control. If you can control what people believe and want and think is the right political policy, why do you need to use violence? You've already accomplished your goal. So this is, I think, a telling quote. When people ask me what I think the role of media is, I say media is God. Media has God-like powers, but not like the kind of Abrahamic monotheist one God. It's more like the Greek pantheon of many, many gods. So in politics, there's many influences. You've got a whole host of economic influences. You've got cultural, religious, ideological influences. But the media is one very powerful God within that pantheon. So it doesn't determine everything, but it's an extremely potent force. And out of all of the gods, I would say it's like Zeus. It's the most powerful god of all these different forces. And then, of course, within Zeus, it's like you've got the whole Hindu pantheon, because the media is not just one thing. You've got all sorts of different outlets. So it's not like the media operates with one mind or one kind of direction, but you do see a lot of groupthink. You do see a lot of similarity of perspective. Journalists do tend to socialize together. So they tend to share ideas, and they tend to think broadly in broadly similar terms. And if you have a sharply different ideological perspective, you're not really going to feel comfortable when you're hanging out with your journalist friends saying, oh, you guys are all idiots, you're wrong, I'm right. You've got social pressure, you've got peer pressure. So, the media is, I say media is God in politics, but it's not unitary. It's not, first of all, it's not the only powerful force in politics. It's one God among many, but I would say the most powerful one. And then within that God, you have a whole other pantheon. You've got many different players, from News Corp to news groups on Reddit, where the media is fundamentally different. So that's my short my short but over long presentation. And please let me.
Thank you very much for the very excellent presentation.
Most
on
welcome.
This topic. I'll have 1-2 questions first. First question is this because you have said sometime that there's a thematic system, thematic network that connects what people think, and they have such believers, and then they will have some bias. It's how to break through this thematic network.
Oh man, that is a really good question, and there is some psychological research on persuasion. But I can't say that I'm 100% confident, or there is no silver bullet that just works all of the time. I think a lot of different perspectives might work, but the thing that I tried to do when I'm talking with someone that their network of schemas are totally different from mine, and they have not read what I've read, they've read other perspectives. I think one thing is try to avoid attacking their ideas directly and saying, you're completely wrong, and now let me give you what is right. Because that is basically creating a situation of threat in their own mind. It's going to hurt. Like, psychologically, that's painful. They're going to react defensively. They're going to try to protect their beliefs, and they're going to discount what you're trying to convince them of. So what I would try to suggest, and there is some research suggesting that this might be effective, is you find something in their web of beliefs, in their network of schemas, their network of information in their brains. You find some of that is in agreement with your own view, like something that's accurate, and you affirm that, or you affirm something about them. Like, you know, I recognize this part of your belief structure is absolutely true, and you try to avoid attacking what they believe directly, and instead try to introduce them to a part of the picture that they haven't seen yet. So if trying to think of an example, but maybe an example wouldn't be good. Keep it abstract.
Yeah.
They have a structure of belief that's very different from your understanding. Try to affirm part of that. You're absolutely right in this, but I don't think you're seeing this picture. So if you add this part of the view to your existing beliefs, I think you'll have a fuller picture of what's going on. So that's the sort of thing that psychological research suggests, that don't try to avoid making them feel defensive, because most likely they're just going to shut you, put up a wall between you, because they're trying to defend themselves. Like, they will literally feel under threat. They'll feel attacked, and they'll be feeling psychological pain. So if you can bypass that and try to avoid attacking their beliefs and saying, yeah, I agree. Like, this part of what you're saying is absolutely true, but have you looked at this side? And then try to add to their beliefs rather than try to get them to reject their beliefs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, good. And another question for you, you said that the media has controlled, actually exclude facts. The power of omission is how the media, I would say, create omit the information and to create what people believe, what their political belief, and how they vote and how they see the world. Then is it possible to build a system, another system to create more information to break through that omission of the media?
Yeah, that's another extremely important question. I mean, honestly, I think the only way you could really do that is so in the US, for instance, you can create lots of websites, you can create YouTube videos, that's all great, but if people don't actually encounter that, you're not doing that job, which is, introducing people to information that was omitted in the media that they are tuning into. I think the only way to really get past this problem is, like I mentioned before, if you buy out News Corp, then you can change the presentation that they use, the information they provide, and provide the information that was omitted. Now, let's say you can't buy out News Corp. Creating television media that's on the same, people clicking through their channels, they actually get to that channel. Honestly, I think that's really the only way that you're going to reach people and introduce them to information that has been omitted before in the past. If you're just doing it through face-to-face conversations, if you're just doing it by YouTube videos or social media posts, I'm not saying that's worthless. No, that's also important. But you're not reaching the masses of people that only get their very biased store of information from TV or from radio. You have to go into those same medium. You have to go into the same medium like television, cable television, or radio in order to provide the information that has been omitted.
You can speak out and try.
Oh, you know what?
Yeah, okay.
A microphone.
I think it's a very interesting talk, and I learned a lot. And after this, I can reinforce what Trump said, that the media lies. And it's not only lying, they propagate fake news. Okay, that is more important than just lying. Okay, instead of just covering up, not telling the truth. Okay, I mean, you are making the cloud, but you are covering up the true thing. But now I would like you to look into the social media, because right now there are a lot of people spend not only on the news, but on the social medias.
Yeah.
But the social media, I like your idea of supply and demand, but I think that the social media is more on the demand side.
Yeah.
Because the supply is just, although the platform is also controlled by Twitter or YouTube, you know. But the people, unfortunately, is very biased themselves. As you said, that the model about the mean and everything, you know. So I don't know how can we get out of this thing. Even you got you buy up a TV station or a media station, but you won't solve, okay, the demand side. I mean, this is I don't like it, because this is like a kind of after I heard about this thing, it's very sad, because it's still like a big brother to totalitarian, okay?
Yeah.
Dictatorship, because we are all controlled, you know. I mean, the people will not know it. If I'm a U.S. citizen, I'm hearing I think I'm happy. Maybe they are like, okay, they are very happy, but inside themselves they are not really understand, you know. I think because right now COVID, we cannot travel too much. I think only traveling and go to a place and see what is the real factor is. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm talking too much. Okay, I'll leave.
No.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you for Dr. Chin.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, that's a really good question, because that is the big challenge. What comes to mind is Say's law in economics, that supply creates its own demand. Well, I think in economics that's not true, but in media I think it is true. Having a supply of, let's say, left-wing perspectives in a major TV station will create its own demand for that. Because if you are flipping through the channels, you see, oh, there's a new channel. It has a totally different perspective than I'd ever seen before. And I start watching it for a while. And say, oh, wow, that makes a lot of sense. Because now my mind my perspective has been influenced, now I am going to demand more of that. So now with social media, I was thinking of this, like, for legacy media, for old media, for TV and radio, what I would want to see is in every mass outlet, like every cable channel, every newspaper that reaches many, millions of people, you would be required to have ideological diversity and debate within that medium. Now that's relatively easy to do when you're talking about TV or radio. When you're talking about social media, it seems a little more difficult, because like Facebook, you're connected only to friends, to people that you meet. And there you run into the problem of, in real life social networks tend to be characterized by homophily. We associate with people that are like us. And that includes, we associate with people who are like us ideologically. So even without any influence from the algorithm, we're more likely to have friends that are thinking like us, so you create echo chambers in social media. And then you have the kinds of negative results like you were talking about, where fake news can spread all over the place on social media, primarily because of demand-side characteristics. I feel good when I see, QAnon story saying that Donald Trump is going to arrest all the pedophile Satanists in the Democratic Party. That makes me feel good. I'm going to share it to my friends. How do you deal with that in the social media space? I think there has to be a form of governance for these private corporations, because right now, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all of them are just for-profit private corporations. I think there has to be some form of international governance. It can't be governed just by these, the CEO of Facebook and Twitter, et cetera. And what that sort of international governance should look to do is to prevent echo chambers from occurring. So if you see in the network that a bit of fake news is spreading through different networks on WhatsApp or Facebook or Twitter, you attach to that an argument against it. So when somebody is sharing, with their, in their network, that QAnon story about Donald Trump is going to arrest the pedophile Satanists, you have another thing attached to it saying, this is probably fake news, and this is the reason why. This whole idea came from, I don't know the history of QAnon, but somebody has looked into this. It would explain, this is the whole history of this idea, and for more information, go here. And that would be attached to everything. So if you're sending something on the opposite side, the Russiagate. Russiagate was the fake news that Trump would talk about. That likewise was also largely just fake news, but the liberal side of the media spread it. So when somebody's sharing information on Facebook or Twitter, that's all about how, oh, look, this Russian guy knew Trump at one time, so that proves that Putin is controlling Trump every day. He gives him direct marching orders. Well, attached to that shared story or tweet or what have you would be an argument against that. So that's very different from how these social media platforms operate right now, and I can't see how any of these private companies would ever do that right now, because that would probably cause fewer people to use those outlets or use those media. Who likes that? I want to spread, I want to share my idea, and I don't want to have, something else arguing against it. But, that's the problem when you have a commercialized media system. You don't do what's good for the society, you do what's good for your company. So if you had, I think, international, some form of international governance, possibly under UN auspices, you could enforce regulations like that. That when you see fake news being spread, you attach along with that, false story, some attempt to show that it's not true.
But that's another question. That would be, who decides what is fake news?
Yeah.
Yes, well, the question is, if you say something like, okay, this is fake news, but actually you are doing something like omitting the true news that perhaps you're doing.
Right. That is the difficult part. So on fake news, it's, what I'm talking about, I don't think solely in terms of fake news. I think of that in terms of all political discussion. So if somebody is sharing an article that's even just a purely economic analysis of the impact of, right now, the reconciliation bill in the US is a big political topic. And so there are some economists who think that amount of new spending will result in inflation. So if somebody's sharing that story, I would want, attached to that, a story saying, yeah, well, that is the view of some economists. Other economists think that that's completely wrong, and this is why. So what I'm saying is that this is not something only for fake news, because that does run into the problem you brought up. Who is to determine what is fake and what's true? So that kind of ideological diversity in debate would be something that you try to ensure throughout the media system, not just for fake news, but even for something that we would all agree is not fake news, I would disagree with those economists. But I wouldn't say that that's fake. I just think that their view of economics is inaccurate. And so I would want to see other perspectives attached, going along for the ride. The debate is what is presented people, not just one view that makes them feel good. That, I think, is the danger.
So is there any other question from the audience? I'll give the mic.
You can, hope would be the result of having this kind of a media system where you basically break up ideological monocultures. Like Fox News right now in the US, you're only going to get the conservative Republican view. That, I think, is harmful. I'm not saying like censor that and make it impossible to encounter. What I'm saying is if you have a large media outlet, you would be forced to have an actual ideological debate. So you can have the same people. You can have Sean Hannity on there saying that coronavirus is made up by the Democrats. You can have the exact same ideas. But what you can't have is the omission of opposing perspectives. So you would have to have, Fox would have to have Noam Chomsky on every now and then. When they have stories on China, they would have to have like somebody supportive of the Communist Party on to debate. This is like unimaginable right now because that's so different from how the media operates. And it probably would result in lower ratings and less money for all of these stations because the people that really believe this, they don't want to hear the opposing perspective. That literally hurts. Psychologically, the part of your brain that processes pain is going to light up when the person has to hear a left-wing perspective or a liberal perspective on Fox News. And likewise, on MSNBC, they would have to have someone like Matt Taibbi, who is critical of the whole Russiagate thing, while they're covering one of their Russiagate stories. And people are not going to like that. That's going to hurt when they hear that this whole Russiagate story is a joke. It's a fever dream. So that's my recommendation for how do you create a democracy appropriate media system, and that's how you that's how you pop these ideological bubbles. That's how you eliminate these ideological echo chambers. And is it going to be bad for business? Absolutely. I mean, I would assume that. I would assume that the MSNBC, Fox News business model is going to get hurt. They're going to lose viewers. However, it actually might be a new niche. It actually might be a way of making money, even as a commercial enterprise, if you advertise that this is a new kind of news channel. It's one where it's all debate. You're going to see perspectives from all over the place. That might work, maybe for the younger generation. I don't know. I'm not coming at this from a business angle, but that would be my ideal system. Is you break up these ideological monocultures, you break up these echo chambers, you pop these ideological bubbles, and make sure that any outlet with a large audience is also giving their audience ideological diversity. If you're like a small, magazine like Socialist Review, Monthly Review, the socialist magazine in the U.S., they have a subscription base of 10,000, I think. If you're a small outlet like that, no need to include like a neoclassical economist, economically liberal perspective alongside the socialist perspective. Fine. That's a small outlet. But if Monthly Review, created a TV station and it became, it got an audience of 5 million viewers, then the media watchdog or media regulator would say, okay, guys, now bring in some right-wingers to debate you. And I'm sure that they would be perfectly happy with that. So anyway, sorry, that was a long-winded answer to your question.
It's very great to have you to have this topic today. And I think our audience has learned a lot about the media. Have you have a question? Oh, yeah, okay. Can you tell me the question?
Oh.
Someone asked how to defend for their childhood. How to defend for their child. They don't want their child getting the false information from the news media, but they have totally no idea on how to stop this case, this scenario, and they are suffering from that, and they are looking for some change. Is it possible to change it?
So hold on.
So the child are not going to get some kind of false information from the media.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can think of when you've got a problem with somebody who has a kind of ideologically homogenous media diet is to try to just promote or encourage them to diversify their media diet. So, okay, you like this station, this TV station, you like this internet website for your news. Like, understand what ideological perspective that's coming from, and then say, okay, well, also read this, also look at this. Try to make sure that the media diet is diverse. That's the only thing I can really think of to try to kind of loosen the grip of having only one view. And because that way you're not forcing them. You're not saying, no, you have to believe this instead. You're saying, look, also learn about this. Just be aware of these other ideological perspectives. Even if you think they're pure evil, even if you think they're absolutely your enemy, shouldn't you know your enemy? So you say, okay, well, at least learn about what these opposing perspectives are thinking, what they're arguing. But you are running into our cognitive conservatism. It's not easy to change anyone's mind about anything. Particularly about politics, but I think that's the only practical step that you can take to. I mean, like I tried this with my parents, who are very much on the right wing of U.S. society. Yeah. So I'm like, guys, just diversify your media diet a little bit. Try reading this. Try looking at this. You don't have to only read something else, but you're completely ignorant of these other perspectives. Don't you think it would be beneficial to at least know what other people are arguing? So
that's another demand bias.
Yeah.
Is there any other question from Zoom? So maybe this is today's. Thank you for watching, and we'll have another topic in the future. And please notice Gang Li Tai and our advertisement future. And thank you very much, Dr. Peter.
Well, you're most welcome, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Okay, I'll see you guys later. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right.
Oh, let's